Speaks, and which will be followed by brief 5-minute responses from 4 industry panelists that we admire so much. You can find their full bios on Grenadine, our virtual platform. But at this point, I'll let Amy and April kick us off.
Hi, everyone. Abby, and I'm one of the co-founders of Distribution Advocates.
Hi, I'm April Speaks. I am also one of the co-founders of Distribution Advocates.
So do we have our first slide? Let's see it.
So just while we're pulling that up, just to kind of give some background, Abby talked a little bit about Distribution Advocates and who we are. And I think, part of the reason for this survey and this data that we collected, we've been having conversations among ourselves. I mean, all of us in Distribution Advocates are filmmakers ourselves, and we often have conversations with ourselves and with other filmmakers, with our peers about going to film festivals to sell our films. That's often what we go to film festivals to do, aside from just showing the film. And so we wanted to collect some data about film as a marketplace and to really think about, or rather to spark a conversation about US film festivals as a marketplace. In other words, as a place where filmmakers go to sell their films. And so we just really wanted to collect some data around that.
Next slide. So how the data was collected. So the study was limited to documentary features only. And we reached out to every documentary feature screened at Sundance, South by Southwest, and Tribeca, and asked a producer of the film to fill out a 10 to 15-minute survey. This self-reported data came from the filmmakers themselves. So just to be clear, it didn't come from sales agents or the festivals. So, and it's meant to be a sort of snapshot, not a comprehensive analysis at this point. We had a pretty good response rate. 81 documentaries responded to our survey across the 3 festivals. The pool size for the different questions, you'll see if you analyze the deck more closely, varies because not all respondents answered every single question. And timing-wise, this is super important. The survey was sent out approximately 1 month after the festival concluded. So an important note, if you're looking at sales press over the course, up until even yesterday, when there was a sales announcement from a festival film, there does seem to be additional sales that happened later since our survey, but that's not captured in this data. There are some, of course, potentially influential factors that aren't analyzed here, including how the film was reviewed at the festival, the subject matter of the film, who was selling the film. And so, many more questions arose from collecting and reviewing the data, perhaps encouraging a more robust study or release of data from sales agents, or maybe a more narrative style questioning around the narratives of how films are sold at festivals as a sales point.
Okay, next slide. So to start things off, we've all had that scenario where you make this great film and your kind of next step is you want to go to a film festival to find distribution, or as we say, to license rights. And that's one of the things that we asked a lot about in this survey, was about licensing rights specifically. So we know how hard it is to get into festivals. So let's look at some of this data. So next, you can go to the next slide. So as Amy mentioned, we did surveys on the three of the top film festivals in the US. And the survey asked the question, before we get to that one, this is just the question of Oh, sorry. No, this is just the festival acceptance rates. I'm jumping ahead. I'm getting ahead of myself. So this is just the festival acceptance rates for documentary features. And as Amy mentioned, we did not include series in this study. So you can see Sundance had 1,730 applications roughly, Tribeca 1,500, South by Southwest 1,250. And out of those numbers of applications, there's 2%, 3.5%, and 4.2% accepted. So that's the rate of films that apply to those festivals that actually got in. For documentary features specifically. Okay, next slide. So we asked the question, we kind of wanted to get a sense of who had previously played at which of these filmmakers had previously played at one of these film festivals. And so this was the data that came back. 57% of accepted films have a producer or director that previously showed a film at the festival. On the next slide. So this is just an example from Sundance. We just kind of pulled out the data. And actually, if you go to the next slide, it just has it larger. So one of the things I want to point out is that these 5 films on the left had 0 rights to sell. And definitely want to stress that, because again, where the whole purpose of this study is looking at film festivals as a marketplace. So 5 of those films out of the 35 films that were accepted came into the festival with no rights to sell. I mean, they had already sold in multiple arenas. There were some films, I believe, that maybe they sold one territory or maybe they sold domestic, but they may have still come into the festival with international rights still open. So those 5 are 0 rights. Okay, next slide. And then, so these demographics that we have here, this is to show who was included in this data pool. So who answered the survey. It's not an analysis of all the documentaries that screened in all 3 festivals. It's literally just an analysis of who filled out the survey. And if you look on the top, it says data obtained from 98 answers. And so there's more answers than there were surveys, because we actually had a number of co-directors. So that's why that number is higher than the number of surveys. So yeah, like I said, this is, it's not an analysis of the documentaries, it's just who answered the survey. The data around documentaries specifically would have to come from the festivals themselves. So yeah, the highest percentage of women who answered, of respondents who answered the survey were women, and white, Caucasian, or European women were the highest demographic. Yeah, next slide.
Next slide. How are films accepted? How are the accepted films funded? Go to the next slide. The survey, we asked producers to estimate the % of funding from various sources. This slide is a handful. Each bar represents a film. And so this gives a snapshot of the sort of budget ranges of the films premiering at festivals and how these were funded. Most notably, there's a lot of funding coming from equity and grants for the films. Next slide. So for this part of the survey, we asked what rights folks retained in the funding process. So as people sought funding for their films, did they sell off rights, whether worldwide, international, broadcast, or whatever? As you can see, the largest percentage of films retained all of their rights in the funding process. Next slide. How did the festival serve filmmakers as a marketplace? Next slide. So the survey asked a series of questions. some of which included, were any rights to your completed film acquired after knowing you were accepted into the festival, but prior to your first screening? Did you license any rights to your film during the film festival, which we considered a verbally closed deal, acknowledging that paperwork probably wasn't done by the time you left? And what rights were acquired and for what term length? And this points out, there were at the point that we asked the question, 58 films sold no rights at all. So that was a large pool. We also asked if folks had sales agents and publicists. The publicist data isn't included here because nearly everyone had a publicist. The sales agent data, you can see the little, I don't know, suitcase beside the orbs, which represent the films. And 8 films sold worldwide rights. Next slide. So back to the Sundance example, and to reiterate, this is again a snapshot in time following what happened at the festival or at the marketplace, not in the subsequent 8 or 9 months. Final slide. So those what the sales look like leaving the festival. And we can say sort of anecdotally, if you do consider those 9 months following the festival, that the numbers of films that licensed rights seem to double. But we don't have information about what happened between the time they left the festival and the time they sold those rights. So we don't know if there's other factors involved. I think that's it. Enough to get a reaction since we're running late. I think Lucy is gonna.
Yeah, can't believe.
Take over. Hey, Lucy, what do you think?
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for sharing those findings. I wasn't surprised, I have to say, but perhaps that's because I've been sort of watching the submissions process, for the last decade while I've been on the programming side. So I know how minuscule that percentage of films is that gets accepted and then gets acquired. I think something that the data collected here reveals is the tension between these festivals' stated goals to discover new voices while also keeping their alumni very close. And I'm glad that you pointed out there at the end that a number of acquisitions do happen in the months after the festival. So I'm guessing that probably the acquisitions numbers we see here may be on the conservative side. I think that the question that I think of when I look at this presentation is, if these top tier festivals exist as a marketplace to connect filmmakers to the industry, then how could this goal be approached differently to get a better result? Is there a better way to do this? And should these festivals see it as a responsibility that they need to serve? I know that the festivals that you're mentioning here, Tribeca, Sundance, South by, they do use, one of the evaluation factors that they do use to consider the success of a festival edition is how many acquisitions took place that year. I'm wondering then if that information could be made public at the end of each year before the next festival edition begins, so that filmmakers can use that knowledge and insight to decide where they spend their submission fees. I think the demographics of the directors didn't surprise me. I was pleased to see female directors dominating the data. I know there is a lack of financing going towards BIPOC and trans and non-binary filmmakers, not just in documentaries, but across the board. So that's a conversation to have about financing. Those are some of my first thoughts, but I'm looking forward to weighing in on other people's comments as well.
Well, thank you, Lucy, with all of your experience at film festivals and insight into the inside of festivals themselves. We're going to ping it over to just a little bit of a word on the format, because I see some folks in chat asking. We will have a brief period of an audience Q&A at the end as well, so don't worry. We're keeping track of your questions, even in this hectic Zoom mode, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So Lucy is making a point about how festivals themselves value the valualization of films. Jason, as somebody who works also on this side of things as a sales agent, would you like to respond next?
Yes, and I love that my symbol is like a little briefcase, that I'm like this little tiny briefcase walking around with wares to sell. You know, I mean, I'm coming at this very much from the perspective of festivals being a marketplace. And that's a lot of the conversation that we have with the programmers in terms of positioning and thinking about films and presenting them in a festival context in the best possible way. You know, the thing that I think is there's a lot of data points that, you know, I think can be expanded on here. And a couple of things that I want to highlight are that what we're seeing, you know, in the past 2 years definitely is a shrinking of festivals, one in the amount of slots that they have. So Sundance pre-pandemic had 16 competition slots for each of their sections. They dropped that down to 10 when they were in virtual mode. They've increased it to 12. But, you know, that has a huge effect on the amount of films that can be programmed. I mean, 4 films or 6 films is still a lot of movies. When you're thinking about the admissions rates being as low as they are. The other thing is that, you know, buyers and industry attendance on festivals, what I'm seeing a lot of, and I don't have any hard data on this, is that people are really shrinking their experience. They're going for a shorter amount of time. They're bringing less people than they normally do. So the effect of the marketplace is that there's a much shorter window where you have people on the ground. And when their time is compressed in that way, it's harder to engage people when they're trying to achieve a lot of different things. And especially with distributors who have films that have been selected for the festival, they're spending a lot of their time, you know, launching their films and the films that they have, and maybe less time looking for new films. So we're seeing a bit of that. And also just sort of the general orientation of the marketplace really being a 365 market where projects are constantly going out to buyers. There's less of a desire or need to hold films to present as completed works. You're seeing a lot of pre-sales. You're seeing a lot of films entering a marketplace off of trailers or sizzle reels. And that experience, I think, changes the types of films that become available to a film festival that wants to be an acquisitions marketplace. You know, the other thing that I think I wanted to highlight is, you know, the month after the film festival is a bit of an arbitrary number. I mean, you have to start somewhere in terms of analyzing data. But for us, you know, the process really starts once the film's, you know, sometimes it's, you know, advocacy work on behalf of getting a film into a film festival and identifying programmers and screening and getting feedback ahead of a selection decision. But also it's that month or two before the festival even starts about building your team, who your publicist is, who's going to be on the ground, what are you going to try to do beforehand? Are you going to pre-screen the movie? How are you talking about the movie to respective potential buyers? Are you going to make links available concurrently with the premiere? There's a lot of decision making that goes in and can affect the timeline of an acquisition decision. I don't think, given this data, I don't think it's meant to imply that, if the film is not a success if it doesn't sell out of the festival. Even for our perspective, we really believe that things need to take the time they do, and we're utilizing festivals for a very specific experience in terms of having people watch a film in person, but also press, word of mouth. There's a lot of other pieces to the festival experience beyond exposing the film to buyers that has to play out concurrently. So it's not necessarily a success or failure if a film doesn't sell in its first month, because for us, we have a strategy 2 months out, 2 hours after premiere, 2 days after premiere, 2 weeks after premiere, 2 months after premiere, on what we're going to do. What is the strategy in terms of next steps? How do you keep a film relevant after its festival premiere? What do we get out of it? What do we do next if we haven't completed a transaction or, found the type of response that we're looking for? It's hard to quantify all of that, but for us, we don't really necessarily go into a festival marketplace in a sort of auction mode, which can be really high risk for certain films. And the sort of expectations have to be there in order to pull it off successfully.
Lots of head nods in the room, Jason. We have a sales agent who's advocating for non-financial modes of valuing films. Thank you, Jason, for speaking up for the art films and the films that need their time. Though I do think it brings up some interesting questions about then, all of the costs associated with exactly what Jason was talking about putting together a team of publicists and all of that. That does cost money. And I know we have a panelist who has direct experience with that this year, Sue Kim, who has 2 films traveling the festival circuit / entering theatrical this year, 3. Sue just corrected me. I apologize. Sue, you don't have to respond directly to that, but do you have any thoughts?
I have a question. So when it says 15 films were first timers at Sundance, does that mean none of the people on, worked on the film were? Okay. Okay. That was my first question. So my second question is that I saw on the financing sheet about how some films were like they're studio films. And like that to me, is really disturbing, because Sundance started as a place for independence. Yeah. And so that means that they're kind of going against what they stand for. Yeah. So I find that kind of a little just sobering, I guess.
I just want to also point out that while we pull out the Sundance data, that was true across all 3 festivals.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I find that troublesome, because especially with Sundance, because it was the film festival that was for the outsiders, and it started as a marketplace for highlighting independent voices, and I think that's changing now. The other thing that I think I'm not surprised by the amount of sales. I think there's a great myth about being discovered. So in terms of my own film that was at Sundance, the producing team worked really hard to kind of line it up in a position to make the sale. And I think often those things are neglected. It doesn't just happen magically. Yeah. And what I'm seeing here is that I think these films are just also costing a lot more than budgets are really going up. That's one of the things I've noticed. And then the other thing I find kind of interesting that I've seen the trend, but to see it on paper, it just confirms what I have been sort of feeling, is that a lot of these rights need to be sold in order to make the film. And I think like doing that also like makes it difficult to retain your voice as a filmmaker. And I think that then there are more parties. So it's harder and harder, I think, to sort of hold on to, what the kind of film that you want to make, and because there'll be so many more vested interests. So I have noticed that, but I guess it's confirmed a bit more now. And then in terms of like the rest of it, I'm not surprised at all.
Thank you very much, Sue. There's a couple, I'm just going to note for the audience, I see that there are more questions, and we have our last respondent teed up. So if you have questions, please just start putting them into chat. We will try to get through as many of them as possible. Our last panelist is Brigitte, who joins us a little bit from an outsider's position, living and working in Berlin for the past many years, running industry markets on the old continent, and looking at all of us Americans and wondering what's happening here. Lucy also has a little bit of this position, so thank you, Lucy. Been working in the US now. So Brigitte, what would you like to respond to?
Yes, it's super funny. I can like start with a little joke, which was like the first time that I went to Sundance, somebody asked me if I could like give or come in as like an expert on the topic of European financing. And I was like, all of it? Like all of Europe? I don't know. I was like, I think it's outside of my wheelhouse, but certainly we are an old continent and we do things in a sometimes old-fashioned and perhaps backwards way. But it's really interesting also to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. And so first, yeah, I would also like, without needing to go into details today, but to really like question and to challenge this idea that film festivals are or should be like an acquisitions market. It's also a really interesting thing, because before I go into like my thoughts about the slides, one of the problems, or one of the issues that I have at the moment is that I have like a mathematical equation that I cannot solve, which is that there are all of these films being made. And in some senses, like it's not easy, but it's easier maybe than it has been in the past to finance documentaries. So we can keep making films at the moment, but then the question is like, where do they go afterwards? Because while the kind of trade press tell us that there are more places than ever before to show our films, more platforms, I don't have like mathematical data on it, but like I have the feeling that that's not actually true at all. It's like the distribution possibilities for documentaries are actually like kind of becoming more and more limited, because also what you see on television is different to what you see in a theatrical situation, is different to what you see on a festival screen. So there also maybe needs to be kind of an accounting for the taste. So the taste of a film festival is fundamentally different to the taste of a streamer. And I would hope that that stays that way, because if we are looking at film festivals as acquisition markets, and if we're pushing to have traditionally acquirable films inside the film festival, then perhaps we're also pushing out the space for films that are more outspoken or sharing a different point of view, or are coming from this truly independent space. For us, I think in Europe, what is a really interesting challenge at the moment is that our market is being privatized. So we're traditionally used to working with public subsidy across the board, from development to distribution. You can even still apply in Europe to your National Film Fund for distribution support, theatrical distribution support. And the cinemas are also supported by public funding to keep them alive. So like we have a super different approach to generating audiences, and we see a different level of responsibility, which also should shift, I would say. In Europe, we need to be more responsible for understanding who our audience is and understanding who we're making films for sure, which hopefully then would like influence our abysmal record on diversity and inclusion inside of those funding structures, where we are 100 years behind the United States in terms of our honesty about it and in terms of our policy to support voices outside of cis white filmmaking practices or people or circuits, whatever you want to call it. So that's like, that I think for me is super interesting inside of this study. Like, how can we leverage these numbers to support and also solidify independent filmmaking practice, while also finding ways for ourselves to, retain our IP, make our money, control kind of the chain of distribution that our films go into, while also maybe being honest with ourselves that at least inside of Europe, like the theatrical market at the moment has totally bottomed out. Cinemas are empty, and it's really just a matter of time before there's a reckoning about that. The public broadcasting system that we're used to working with also, the possibilities for working inside of it have shrunk. So we're very interested also in working with these private partners or private equity, private broadcasters, etc. But for us, we're also just working out how to do that. And so I'm trying to look at it in a non-judgmental way and find the best way for filmmakers to work. But for me, those models are super, super unclear at the moment. But yeah, so I think my last thought just about this slide about the Sundance Film Festival acquisitions that are happening is that it's especially like this time of like 1 month after the film festival. So for me, at least in my very unscientific data that I've collected word of mouth, is when you read in Variety or Screen Daily about acquisitions that have happened on site in the film festival, actually those are deals that have been lined up to be announced at Sundance to then have the waterfall effect of like creating the buzz for more sales to occur. And also what you shouldn't doubt, especially US-based film or US-based filmmakers, is that if your film is selected, especially for Sundance, it has that structuring effect that means that it flows into the film festivals outside of the US market as well, because that's where lots of our festival programmers are looking to set their festival programs for. And then if you can have that flow into these channels, then you can reach buyers outside of the US. So that's still a thing, but it doesn't really solve the problem for the 98% of films submitted to Sundance that don't get selected. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. That was the whole screen that you just let us know. Also, just for the panelists, we are hearing from folks online that our audio is a little bit muddled. So maybe we can just, I think for those of you in this room who can hear us just fine, but maybe we can just project a little bit more for the rest of the session. Lucy, I know you need to head out soon, so I'm actually going to give the right of first response to the responses if you wanted to add anything before you leave, to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, there was one thing that I think we haven't touched on yet, and that's not really showing up in the data here, which is that there is a certain type of documentary that attracts interest from the industry. And I think that nuance between the sort of topical headline grabbing docs and the more intimate personal stories, that's a conversation that we could get into for another hour. Usually, I think I would see a good festival lineup being a balance of both of those things. Probably the more high profile docs in the opening and closing slots, and then these smaller, more intimate films in the competition section. And I think that is present in, was certainly present in the Tribeca lineup this past year. But it's an interesting detail that, you know, is something to talk about, I think, with acquisition heads and distributors about what they're looking for when they're at a festival and assessing the titles that are available.
Thank you, Lucy. We will let you go now, but before Lucy leaves, I just want to say we are going to move into the audience Q&A portion, and I want to point out in chat that we had a question from Jennifer Huang asking Sue specifically if you could talk about what the team did to line up the film for a sale. Lucy did already pre-answer the question, which is something that was a part of the survey, but not a part of the preliminary findings. Lucy wrote, to respond to that, I think it's worth noting that a lot of the acquisition activity takes place once the programming selections are made, in the window between those invitations going out and the festival happening, even though it might be announced as an acquisition at the festival. So I don't know, Sue or Amy or April or anybody here would like to answer that question.
In terms of the preparations?
Yeah.
Well, I think the whole thing is to like kind of like then look, once your film gets into Sundance, is to look at it and say, how are we going to best put this film out into the world at Sundance with that opportunity? And so first thing is I think about like who could represent the film best in terms of like the press, because that's where you get a lot of buzz. And so, I kind of like think about who would like the film, who would push the film, who will do that sort of like internal like things that, because the press agent can talk to people and say things that I can't say and the film team can't say, and also to people that the film team doesn't have access to. So, so that was probably number one. Then number two, I think about like in terms of like sales agents, and I have done my own sales before, but if you're going to Sundance, like it is complicated. So I like to work with the sales agent. And so I think about, well, of the sales agents that I know, and then you sort of start at the top and you think like, well, who's going to like the film? And who's going to represent the film for you, in the way that you want it to be represented. So those are the kind of things we talk about as a team. And then I, send the film out and see who's interested. And I don't normally send it to everyone. I sort of target who I want to talk to. So I'll make a listing like, oh, this person is my number one sales agent. Number two is this person. And so I'll go through the line. And the other thing is once you're in Sundance and the announcements are made, people start contacting you as well. So a lot of this is happening before the announcement. So it's right, you get in and then like, you're just like bombarded with like work to do. And I think it's overwhelming if you've never had that experience before. So I think the first time I went to, I have to say, the first time I went to Sundance, I learned all my lessons because I think I did everything wrong. So that's kind of the things you need to think about. And it's really, you kind of have to like, it's really hard because at the time you're still trying to finish your film and you're thinking about all of these things. So it's not an easy thing to do.
Thank you, Sue. I'm just starting from the top now with these questions. Please continue to put your questions in the chat. We have an early question. It would also be so helpful to understand what the deals these films are receiving look like. For indie films, the price that streamers pay for docs has been going steadily downward for the majority of films. Maybe Amy and April, you could actually answer why this data was actually rather difficult to receive.
So not surprisingly, filmmakers don't want to report this data. And since the filmmakers were self-reporting this data, our data was fairly incomplete on this. We did ask the question, what percentage of your budget was recouped from licensing advances during the film festival? So we didn't present that here because one, the data pool was so small, the films, there were so few films at the festival, but I can generally say that it was a pretty split scenario between 100% recoupment or more, or less than 25%. So there was nothing sort of nuanced in the middle. It seemed that the percentage of budgets covered from sales advances were either robust or fairly small. We would love to have someone do a more detailed study around that because that's super interesting question.
Yes. Also, Emily Copley from the Vickers posted into chat. They are in the next week or so also releasing a study about the cost of documentaries internationally. But Emily, it would be lovely to hear from you in chat if you have data on the sales price of documentaries. This is the hardest thing that we found to gather. I have a big question from Beatty Finzi. Thank you, Beatty, for your question. She wrote, above and beyond the effectiveness of the festivals as a means to secure distribution, I am wondering how far how the panel thinks that the global market is working post-pandemic. Does the panel have observations on this or data to support this? Jason, you had mentioned a lot about the changes and things that are happening. Perhaps you would like to start?
Yeah, I actually wanted to address a few points prior. I think, what we're seeing in the documentary space in terms of budgets are going up, especially in and around projects financed by equity. And I actually think that's really a reflection of one, I think in a lot of ways, filmmakers getting paid. So it's not a bad thing. When you're taking equity, you should absolutely pay yourself the cost of your work and your worth. And especially with the assumption that, your financier is going to take a premium on their investment, they're going to participate in back end. And the threshold for you to start making money on top of whatever your salary is significantly higher. And when you're seeing films in the $1 million range that are principally financed on equity, you should assume that, the filmmakers aren't seeing significant returns until at least probably double what that cost is returns to the investor. So, that's a consideration on some of these budgets, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. In terms of the global marketplace, it's really tricky. I think for American films, it's negligible. And we're not seeing as much opportunities, different types of opportunities for nonfiction as there has been in the past. We're not seeing a robust broadcast sale marketplace for the average documentary, which is starting to push films even more into a sort of global mindset on how to sell, and why the priority is on global streamers and global distribution apparatuses, because they can value a film in a way that is a little more compelling than going territory by territory. That's not the case for every film, of course, and it really depends on what the film is and the topic and how much resonance it has with a global marketplace. But by and large, especially the films coming out of American film festivals by American filmmakers, there's not a lot of, there's no dedicated slots. Diversity and inclusion, as Bridget sort of implied, is not really a priority in putting together a comprehensive lineup.
Yeah, apologies. There's one person, if you can mute. I think we are. Testing. Okay. Now. Okay, I think this is good now. All right. Jason, so sorry to cut you off.
I feel like I'm in the bottom of the ocean now, and I have thought, but I think partially just to Bridget's, like, the sort of strategy and what I'm seeing international partners are looking for, it's a bit different in terms of what they're looking for than sort of US buyers, and also global streamers who are predominantly US based in their acquisitions, budgets, modes, individuals buying on behalf of these companies.
Jason, you said it all. Thank you for that interview. And thank you everyone for traveling underwater with us, for all of the echoes. We have a few minutes left. I've been, by the way, for anyone in the virtual audience, if you have questions about how the rest of the morning sessions have been going, I have been, this is Abby speaking, I've been answering them in chat under Sergio's name. Thank you all again for your patience. We have a very interesting question from Simon Lord. How successful have attendees at festivals, that is, filmmakers who don't have a film accepted at the festival, who I suppose might be participating formally or informally in the market of the festival, than in selling films they have made at festivals? Any impressions on this one?
I don't understand the question.
So
I can try it. I can
Yeah.
give a stab at it.
Yeah, we didn't really address that in our data.
Yeah, look, I can tell you this. So I worked for a film, well, I was the head of a film market for 6 years, but I worked for that market for 10 years. And every year it became more and more challenging to sell films inside of our market activities that weren't in a premiere status inside of the film festival, or they were in the film festival in a non-competitive sector, but spoke directly to our national audience, which was Germany, which is a big territory where you can still do okay sales. If you have sales representation from a sales agent who is there with their slate of films, then like discussions are happening. And now I'm speaking also specifically about outspoken creative documentaries, not formatted television, just also to be clear, because two different things. Then I think that reputable sales agents with access to international broadcasters, when they visit a market, possibly are selling things that are on their slates, but then it's at the specific markets like MIP.com, where buyers conglomerate together with sales agents in the absence of filmmakers to really do business. And I think if you're interested in knowing, do films sell at film festivals that are not in the program, then it's good to be in touch with someone from IDFA that has docs for sale, which is like a specific marketplace set up to sell the rights of finished films to those who can acquire them. But I know that it's no secret, to speak also not on their behalf, but of observing the activities that happen at Docs for Sales every year, that it becomes more and more challenging to sell films if they aren't selected in that festival. But it's really hard to make like blanket statements, because for every film, there's a different strategy and there's a different sales possibility, let's say. And festival films inside of the competitions of film festivals look like one thing because they're selected by the same people, etc. So it's really hard to say like, yes, take your film to the film festival and sell it, because it really is, you really need somebody to help you develop a strategy to make sure that because not all the buyers go to all the markets, like at all the film festivals. It's a big old idiosyncratic galaxy out there.
One thing I will say, because I think people are interested, is sometimes I use those, like if I'm going, because I have several films that I'm working on at the same time. So if I'm at a festival with one film, I might start talking up the other films as a way to sort of generate like interest in the film. And I think that's quite effective. The sale might not happen or some at that place, but I think it's more about creating awareness of things to come.
you're always working on all of your films at once, for your thing.
Sort of, yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much.